Isn't the point of traveling to get away from it all? To feel the best you've ever felt? Then maybe you should check out Aruba. You'll spend your time relaxing on cool, white, sandy beaches and floating in healing blue water. You'll meet locals brimming with gratitude for an island that redefines what a paradise can be. When your trip comes to an end, you won't need another vacation because you just had the vacation. That's the Aruba effect. Plan your trip at Aruba.com.
Venice is on its knees. That was the cry when the lagoon city suffered through some of the worst flooding in its history. It was the highest tide in 50 years, and with it came the looming threat that seawater would move up and into the historic monuments and works of art in the equally historic city. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. The powerful surges of rising water driven by ferocious winds, together they created a storm that overwhelmed the critical seawalls, smashed brick docks, and shoved boats up and onto the streets. This day in weather history. In a normal world where tourism is in full swing, Venice is visited by millions from around the world every year as visitors literally pilgrimage to see such immortal landmarks as St. Mark's Basilica and La Venice Opera House. But thanks to this truly horrific force of nature, both were underwater. At first blush, you would think that with this being the sixth time in St. Mark's Basilica history, it has flooded. There would be a level of checked concern at best. But when you then factor in some relevance, it opens the eyes wide to the truth. Sure, St. Mark's was flooded for the sixth time in its history, but its history spans 1,200 years. And, according to church records, 4 of those 6 floods had now occurred within the past only 20 years. Now, one raises a Spockian eyebrow in wonder. The waters in Venice peaked at 1.87 meters, about 6 feet. That is actually just 2 wee little inches below the highest flooding ever recorded in Venice. That happened back in 1966. But this had a devastating effect. It submerged over 80% of the city already below sea level. This resulted in ground floors of houses being totally devastated, while the picturesque and movie-famous street-level restaurants and their kitchens were completely destroyed. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider. But there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective, but oftentimes they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. Native Venetians have historically remained optimistic that the 1966 flood that I mentioned earlier, against which all events are compared since, by the way, was just an, quote, isolated event and, come on now, stop me if you've heard this one before, highly unlikely to be repeated in any one person's lifetime. Yeah, we've all heard that naivety before, and it never ends well for those who are complacent. For this region, their beautiful low-lying islands, coastal cities, and vulnerable seaside zones, they are prone to future sea level rise accelerations. And it is accelerating. We have to admit that. Futurists look to Venice as, quote, the canary in the coal mine. But because of its fame, that is likely the most ironic reason that the world has not acted yet. Now, what happened to Venice here may also be unique when you look at the actual physics of a storm surge. We have storm surges in other parts of the world, for example, along the coasts of eastern United States and in the Gulf of Mexico. But what makes Venice's storm surge unique is its location at the upper end of an elongated, semi-enclosed, almost enclosed basin. You see, it's like a turbine in that once a storm has moved over and the winds abate, the basin just keeps on oscillating for a few more days. These are what we call seiches. Again, we see these in other places around the world, but for the unique geography and topography of Venice, there have been many examples of, quote, day after floods, where the Seiche is still kicking and screaming as if nothing had changed. And this is what will then go on to flood the town, even under an otherwise calm blue sky. So on this day in 2019, there was an area of low pressure that dropped in from the north. It hit the very hilly terrain and caused a tighter wind gradient. This equals stronger winds and gusts. But if you have mountains to create a stronger wind field in Venice, you also have the very unique channeling effect from the mountain ranges bordering the sea. They are the Apennines to the west and the Dinaric Alps to the east. The floods on that day killed 2 people and created hundreds of millions of euros worth of damage. The cost of repairing St. Mark's Basilica alone was estimated to have been 2.2 million euros. This day in weather history. Tomorrow is November 13th, and a volcano in Colombia that had been dormant for over 70 years woke up angry on November 13th of 1985. It produced an enormous landslide that buried and destroyed the town of Armero in Tolima. It became known as the Armero Tragedy, the deadliest of its kind in recorded history. That's tomorrow on This Day in Weather History with me, your host, Chris May.